The glass doors of Elite Motors slid open with a hushed hiss, letting in a swirl of hot, dusty air that felt entirely out of place in the air-conditioned sanctuary of wealth. Standing on the pristine white tiles was Father Thomas, a man whose presence felt like a smudge on a masterpiece. He was in his late 60s, his face a map of deep lines carved by years of mountain winds and selfless service. His black cassock was faded to a charcoal grey, the hem frayed and dusted with the pale earth of the valley. His shoes, sturdy leather, were scuffed and dull, telling of miles walked where pavement didn't exist. Around him, the showroom was a temple of modern engineering. Sunlight bounced off the polished chrome of sports cars that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The air smelled of leather and success. It was a sterile world, where everything had a price tag and everyone was judged by their appearance. Father Thomas didn't have a watch. He had a mission. He ignored the sleek convertibles and walked straight toward a row of high-roofed transport vans. He inspected them with a surgeon's precision. He ran his calloused hands over the sliding door seals, peered at the suspension, and checked the interior volume with a focused intensity. He wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for a vessel. From behind a mahogany desk, Marcus watched the priest with a growing sense of irritation. To Marcus, Elite Motors was a kingdom of status, and he was its gatekeeper. He wore a suit that cost 3 months of a priest's salary. When he saw Father Thomas, he didn't see a man of God. He saw a drifter, a time waster, who had likely wandered in looking for the nearest soup kitchen. Marcus turned his back on the old man, focusing his sycophantic smile on a wealthy client, debating the color of leather interior. He made sure to speak loudly, punctuating his sales pitch with sneers and sideways glances at the uninvited guest. He muttered something about how the neighborhood was going downhill if beggars felt comfortable walking into such a fine establishment. Despite the heavy atmosphere of judgment, Father Thomas remained calm. He didn't flinch at the insults or the cold stares. He waited until the client moved toward the coffee bar before approaching Marcus. With a gentle, raspy voice, he offered a polite greeting, but Marcus didn't even look up from his tablet. The manager waved a hand, telling the father that the exit was through the front and that there were no donations to be given today. Father Thomas stood his ground, his eyes clear and unwavering. He explained that he wasn't there for a handout, but to purchase 5 top-of-the-line vans today. The statement was absurd to Marcus. He let out a mocking laugh that echoed through the showroom. He looked the father up and down, lingering on the scuffed shoes and the worn fabric of the cassock. He threatened to call security, mocking the idea that a man who looked like he hadn't seen a paycheck in 40 years could afford a fleet of premium vehicles. In the corner, Sarah, a junior saleswoman, felt a sharp pang of guilt. She saw the exhaustion in the father's eyes, a depth of weariness that went beyond physical tiredness. While Marcus continued his tirade, Sarah slipped away. She returned, ignoring Marcus's furious glare, and offered Father Thomas a cold glass of water. It was a small gesture, a tiny spark of humanity in a room made of glass and steel. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Marcus had finally had enough. He stepped from behind his desk, his face flushed with arrogance. He reached out, grabbing Father Thomas by the arm to escort him toward the sliding doors. But as his fingers tightened on the worn fabric, Father Thomas didn't resist. He simply stopped and looked at the clock hanging above the entrance. His voice was not gentle. It was urgent, carrying a weight that made even the wealthy businessman stop and listen. "Please, Marcus," the father whispered, his eyes locked on the ticking seconds. "I have less than 3 hours before the window closes forever, and once it shuts, no amount of money will be able to reopen it." Marcus let out a sharp, jagged laugh that cut through the sterile quiet of the showroom. He didn't release his grip on the priest's arm, instead tightening it as he leaned in, his face inches from the older man's. He mocked the idea of a 3-hour deadline, suggesting with a sneer that perhaps the father was running late for a soup kitchen shift, or that the holy wine was sitting out in the sun. The wealthy businessman, who had been lingering near a silver coupe, wandered over, swirling a tumbler of amber liquid. He joined in the ridicule, adding that if the good father wanted a fleet of vans, he should probably start by praying for a miracle, or perhaps checking the local junkyard. They stood there, 2 men defined by their bank accounts, laughing at a man they believed had nothing. Sarah felt a cold shiver of revulsion. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear, asking Marcus to let the man go. She saw the way Father Thomas looked at the clock, not with the panic of a man who was late, but with the hollow, haunting gaze of someone who knew exactly what happened when time ran out. Marcus ignored her, his eyes fixed on the priest's scuffed shoes. He demanded to see proof of funds, betting the entire dealership that the father didn't even have a basic credit card, let alone the millions required for 5 premium transport vehicles. He whispered that holy water and good intentions didn't pay for precision German engineering. Instead of shrinking under the weight of their contempt, Father Thomas seemed to transform. His posture, usually bowed by the weight of his years, straightened with a sudden, startling authority. He began to speak, but the words that flowed from his lips were not those of a humble clergyman. He spoke with the cold, rhythmic precision of a man who had once dominated high-stakes boardrooms. He detailed the exact technical specifications he required: reinforced chassis capable of sustaining heavy loads on unpaved mountain switchbacks, and high-capacity electrical systems for medical-grade ventilation units. He spoke of torque ratios and suspension dampening with a level of expertise that left Marcus momentarily speechless. For a brief, flickering moment, the ghost of a man who once managed global capital hovered in the room. A man who understood the language of power far better than the salesman ever would. But the moment of authority was quickly buried under Marcus's renewed arrogance. He didn't care about technical specs. He cared about the image of his floor. He told the father that the performance was impressive, but talk was cheap. He pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the security alert, and stated that if the father couldn't produce a bank guarantee within 30 seconds, he would be forcibly removed for trespassing. The wealthy businessman chuckled, adding that the father was probably just looking for a warm place to hide from the afternoon heat. Sarah, standing just inches away, noticed a small, crinkled piece of paper sticking out of the father's cassock pocket. It was a child's drawing, colored with frantic, heavy strokes of a yellow crayon. It depicted a bright, smiling sun over a green valley. In the bottom corner, the name Lucia was written in shaky, earnest print. The paper was stained with a single, dried circle of salt, a teardrop that spoke of a grief too heavy for words. Sarah felt her heart twist. This wasn't the delusion of a drifter. It was the mission of a grieving man. The tension reached a breaking point as Marcus began to dial the authorities. He shouted that the circus was over and that Elite Motors didn't cater to beggars or men of the cloth who had lost their way. He signaled for the 2 large security guards near the entrance to move in. The father didn't flinch as the guards approached. He didn't plead or shout. Instead, he reached down with slow, deliberate movements and unbuckled the brass latches of his weathered leather briefcase. The metal clicked loudly in the silence. Marcus expected to see a handful of change or perhaps more children's drawings, but as the lid fell back, the harsh showroom lights illuminated a thick, heavy stack of documents. At the very top lay a series of terminal medical reports, their red urgent stamps bleeding into the white paper, and beneath them, a final legal notice of property sale bearing the official seal of the local archdiocese and a paid-in-full stamp. The documents didn't just represent money. They represented a desperate final vow Father Thomas had made in the silence of a cold mountain night. He spoke now, his voice no longer that of a humble priest, but carrying the weight of an advocate for the forgotten. He explained that these 5 vans were not for the church as a building or a monument to faith. Instead, they were to be converted into mobile intensive care units, outfitted with life-saving technology for the children of the high ridges where the city's ambulances refused to travel. The wealthy businessman slowly set his glass of amber liquid onto a nearby marble table, the ice clinking with a sound that felt like a sudden, sharp judgment. Marcus's face began to pale as the father reached into his pocket and pulled out the drawing Sarah had seen. He held it up, the bright yellow sun catching the sterile LED lights of the showroom. "This was Lucia," he said softly. She was 6 years old, and she lived in a village that only sees the sun for a few hours a day. 2 nights ago, she died in my arms in the back of a rusted station wagon because the portable oxygen tank ran dry miles from the nearest clinic. A vehicle with the ventilation systems I'm asking for would have kept her breathing long enough to reach the hospital. The silence in Elite Motors was no longer the quiet of luxury. It was the suffocating weight of a grief that none of their money could buy away. Father Thomas then pointed to the legal notice at the bottom of his briefcase. It was the deed to the historic parish chapel and the small, rocky plot of land it sat upon. He revealed that he had sold the only property the community owned, the very roof over his head, to cover the cost of these vehicles. He had traded his sanctuary for the survival of the children. Marcus looked down at the medical reports, his fingers trembling as he recognized the letterhead of a charitable foundation. There, on a list of potential donors who had never responded to the plea for transport vans, was his own family name. The realization hit him like a physical blow, stripping away his pride. The dealership owner, who had been watching from the glass-walled mezzanine, finally descended the stairs. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate as he bypassed Marcus and walked straight to Father Thomas. He didn't ask for a credit check. He took the medical files into his hands, his eyes softening as he looked at the children's faces. He turned to Marcus, his voice a cold edge of disappointment, and told him that his career as a manager ended the moment he forgot that a person's worth isn't measured by the shine of their shoes. He ordered the 5 best vans to be moved to the service bay for medical conversion, announcing that Elite Motors would cover the entire cost and return the deed of the parish property to the father immediately. The community gathered as the sun began to set, casting a long amber glow across the pavement. The vans were lined up, their white paint gleaming like beacons of hope. On each side, in a delicate script that matched the child's drawing, were the words, "Lucia's wings." Before the father climbed into the lead vehicle, he approached Marcus, who stood alone by the garage doors. He didn't offer a lecture. He simply placed a hand on the younger man's shoulder and offered forgiveness, a gift Marcus realized he didn't deserve but desperately needed. As the fleet drove toward the mountains, the sunset bathed the world in the same golden light Lucia had loved, a promise that while one sun had set, 5 more were now rising to meet the dawn.